There is a phrase that Xi Jinping has used repeatedly in private meetings with foreign leaders, in internal party documents, and increasingly in public speeches. The East is rising, the West is declining. Not as a hope, not as a prediction, as a statement of observed fact. A conclusion drawn from evidence that Beijing has been systematically collecting, analyzing, and acting on for years. And the reason that phrase matters, the reason it should alarm anyone paying serious attention to where the world is heading, is that China is not just saying it. China is building its entire grand strategy around it. Every military decision, every trade policy, every diplomatic maneuver, every calculation about Taiwan, about the South China Sea, about Russia, about the future of the global monetary system. All of it is downstream of one core belief. The West is weak, and it is getting weaker, and the window to act on that weakness is open right now. In the spring of 2021, that belief showed its face publicly for the first time at full intensity. A senior Chinese diplomat sat across from American Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Anchorage, Alaska, and said something that had not been said in that kind of setting in a very long time. He said the United States was not qualified to speak to China from a position of strength. He said it on camera, in front of journalists, without hesitation, without diplomatic softening. And then his colleague Yang Jiechi delivered a 12-minute lecture, unprompted, unrequested, and uninterrupted, about American hypocrisy, American racial violence, American electoral dysfunction, and America's declining moral authority to lead anything. The American diplomats sat across the table looking genuinely stunned. They should not have been, because that moment was not a diplomatic incident. It was not a miscalculation or an emotional outburst from an undisciplined official. It was a signal, carefully calibrated, deliberately public, precisely timed. A signal that something had changed in Beijing's assessment of the global balance of power. That the careful, measured, quietly deferential tone Chinese diplomacy had largely maintained for decades was over. That China had looked at the West, at its politics, its institutions, its military overreach, its financial crises, its internal divisions, and made a judgment. And that judgment was that the era of pretending the West was still unassailable was finished. Understanding why China believes what it believes, and why that belief is reshaping every consequential decision being made in Beijing right now, is one of the most important things any serious person needs to grapple with. Because China is not wrong about everything it sees when it looks west. And the parts it is right about are the parts that should concern us most deeply. The Chinese Communist Party has been studying the West with extraordinary intensity for decades. Not with admiration, with the focused, clinical attention of a competitor trying to understand the structural weaknesses of a rival it intends to surpass. And what it has concluded, what the internal documents, the public speeches, the strategic frameworks, and the diplomatic behavior all consistently reflect, is that the West is suffering from a set of problems that are not temporary, not cyclical, and not fixable within the constraints of the Western political system as it currently operates. The first and most fundamental of those problems, in Beijing's assessment, is time horizon. Democratic systems, as they actually function in practice, operate on electoral cycles of 4 or 5 years. Politicians make decisions based on what will win the next election. They avoid painful, long-term decisions that produce short-term costs. They prioritize visible, immediate results over structural investments whose benefits arrive after they have left office. The incentive structure of electoral democracy, as Beijing sees it, is almost perfectly designed to produce short-term thinking at precisely the historical moment when long-term thinking is most urgently required. China's leadership operates on a different timeline. The Communist Party thinks in decades, in some cases in generations. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's global infrastructure investment program spanning over 140 countries, was designed with a 30 to 40-year horizon. China's semiconductor self-sufficiency program, accelerated dramatically by American export controls, is operating on a 10 to 15-year development timeline that no democratic government facing quarterly approval ratings could realistically commit to. China's military modernization program, launched in earnest in the early 2000s, has been pursued with a consistency and a budget trajectory that has never been subject to the kind of political disruption that regularly derails Western defense programs. When Xi Jinping looks at the West and sees leaders consumed by the next news cycle, making decisions based on approval ratings, reversing their predecessors' policies the moment they take office, and treating long-term strategic commitments as optional depending on domestic political wins, he does not see peers powers operating by different rules. He sees a structural vulnerability, a built-in handicap, a system constitutionally incapable of the kind of sustained, coherent, long-term strategic commitment that great power competition requires. And he has evidence. America's withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership the moment Donald Trump took office in 2017 told every country in the Indo-Pacific that American strategic commitments have a 4-year expiration date. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 reinforced the message globally. The repeated fights over NATO funding, the debt ceiling crises that periodically bring the world's largest economy within hours of a self-inflicted default, the inability to pass a federal budget on time in most years. From Beijing's perspective, these are not random events. They are symptoms of a system whose internal contradictions are becoming increasingly unmanageable. The second thing China sees when it looks at the West is political fragmentation so severe it is beginning to resemble systemic dysfunction. The United States Congress has become a legislature that struggles to perform its most basic functions. The national debt ceiling has been weaponized as a political tool that periodically brings the global financial system to the edge of catastrophe. 2 impeachments, an attempted insurrection at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, broadcast live around the world. A former president criminally indicted, then re-elected. A political system so polarized that the most basic questions of governance have become partisan warfare with no resolution in sight. China's state media covered every moment of January 6th with sustained, detailed attention, not as an aberration, as a revelation, as the true face of American democracy finally visible without the usual diplomatic packaging. The message to Chinese domestic audiences was explicit. This is what the system that claims the right to lecture China actually looks like from the inside. Europe presents a different version of the same problem. A continent of 27 nations attempting to make consequential collective decisions by consensus in an era when the political center is collapsing in almost every major member state simultaneously. Germany, paralyzed by its own economic identity crisis. France, unable to form a stable governing majority. Italy, skeptical of the European institutions it depends on. Hungary, actively undermining European unity from the inside while receiving European funds. The EU's response to crises is consistently slower, more diluted, and more internally compromised than the situation requires. Beijing watches European decision-making with a mixture of contempt and strategic satisfaction. A Europe that cannot coordinate its China policy because member states have incompatible economic dependencies, and that conducts its most sensitive security debates publicly in a process that gives every interested party maximum advance notice, is not a strategic rival. It is a strategic opportunity. The third thing China sees is what it considers the West's moral exhaustion, its inability to defend the values it claims to represent without immediately undermining those claims with its own behavior. The Iraq War, the 2008 financial crisis, in which Western institutions destroyed trillions of dollars of global wealth through recklessness and then received government bailouts while ordinary people received austerity. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, the Snowden revelations, the COVID vaccine hoarding, in which the world's wealthiest nations secured doses for multiple rounds of their own populations while poor countries waited, despite years of rhetoric about global solidarity. China has cataloged every one of these, not because Beijing is genuinely offended by Western hypocrisy. A government that operates the Xinjiang detention system has no standing to lecture anyone about human rights, but because the catalog is strategically useful. Every time a Western leader criticizes China's human rights record, Beijing produces the catalog. Every time an American official invokes the rules-based international order, Beijing points to Iraq. The whataboutism is transparent and cynical. But in the global South, in the African countries, the Southeast Asian nations, the Latin American governments Beijing is systematically courting, it works. Because those countries have their own memories of Western behavior, and Beijing's message resonates, that Western moral authority is performance rather than principle, that the rules-based international order is a system designed by the West for the West's benefit, that China offers partnership without lectures attached. Now here is where Beijing's assessment becomes not just strategically significant, but potentially historically decisive. China is not merely observing Western weakness, it is timing around it. The Taiwan question, the issue most directly capable of turning Chinese-American competition into open military conflict, is being managed by Beijing on a timeline explicitly calibrated to the trajectory of American power. Xi Jinping has instructed the People's Liberation Army to be ready for a Taiwan operation by 2020. 2027. That timeline is not arbitrary. It reflects a precise calculation about the window of Chinese military advantage over American forward-deployed forces in the Western Pacific. A window that exists right now, and that American military investment is racing to close. China's military budget has grown at an average of approximately 7% annually in real terms for over 2 decades. The PLA Navy has become the largest navy in the world by number of vessels. China has built and militarized artificial islands in the South China Sea, creating military bases in international waters in direct defiance of a 2016 international arbitration ruling it simply declared invalid and ignored. It has developed hypersonic missiles, anti-satellite weapons, and cyber capabilities specifically designed to neutralize the technological advantages that American military dominance depends on. And it is doing all of this while the United States simultaneously manages the Russia-Ukraine war, the Middle East conflicts, the Taiwan contingency, the North Korea nuclear program, and a domestic political environment so fractured that defense budgets are negotiated in the context of debt-ceiling standoffs and government shutdown threats. Beijing is not wrong that this is a dangerous amount of simultaneous exposure. It is not wrong that American military and diplomatic bandwidth is being stretched across more simultaneous crises than at any point since the Cold War. And it is not wrong that a West this internally divided, this politically distracted, and this constitutionally committed to short-term thinking is going to struggle to mount the kind of sustained, coherent, decades-long strategic response that matching Chinese power requires. But here is what Beijing is getting wrong, and it is getting some things significantly wrong. The assumption that democratic dysfunction equals strategic incapacity has historical counterexamples that should give Beijing pause. Western democracies looked dysfunctional and divided in the 1930s too. The response to Russian aggression in Ukraine, the speed and scale of Western military assistance, the economic sanctions regime, the unexpected NATO unity, exceeded almost every Chinese prediction about what fragmented democracies could actually deliver when sufficiently motivated. The assumption that economic interdependence gives China permanent leverage over Western economies is being revised in real time. The decoupling that Beijing assumed would be too painful to pursue is happening. Slowly, expensively, imperfectly, but happening. Semiconductor export controls, investment screening, friendshoring of critical supply chains. The West is paying a real cost to reduce its Chinese dependency, and it is paying that cost anyway. And the assumption that the Global South is permanently available as a Chinese strategic constituency is being tested by Chinese behavior itself. Debt concerns in Africa, territorial disputes with India, economic competition with Southeast Asian manufacturers. China's partners are not always as reliable as the Belt and Road speeches suggest. But none of those corrections change the fundamental dynamic that is shaping the world right now. China believes the West is weak. It has specific, evidence-based, carefully documented reasons for that belief. And it is making decisions about Taiwan, about the South China Sea, about Russia, about the global monetary system, about who leads the 21st century, based on that belief, today, right now. The Anchorage moment in 2021 was not an aberration. It was a preview of a China that has decided the period of deference is over, that the balance of power has shifted enough to say openly what it thinks, that the West's internal contradictions are deep enough and its strategic attention fragmented enough that the cost of directness is now lower than the cost of restraint. The West can debate whether the assessment is accurate. It can point to Ukraine, to semiconductors, to NATO's renewed purpose, to the democratic resilience that has surprised skeptics before. But it cannot afford to dismiss it, because the parts that are accurate are the parts that Beijing is building its most consequential and most dangerous decisions around. The question is not whether China thinks the West is weak. It does, clearly, confidently, and with mounting evidence it considers conclusive. The question is whether the West is going to prove it right.